For more people walking in, there are free spaces in the first row. So I guess we can start with the next one. There are 2 more sessions coming up before we actually change coffee to beer, I hope. The next presentation is from Philip. He's actually from Zurich. One of the locals. He will talk about a really interesting thing where, especially in Zurich, but also overall, there is a big buzzword called Scrum or Agile. He worked as a Scrum Master itself, with an agency here in Zurich, and will tell us about sketching, wireframe, and prototyping in an Agile environment. So, Philip, nice to have you here and on your stage.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Hi, wow, I'm really pleasantly surprised by this full room. I would have thought that everybody is going to the other talk about performance, JavaScript performance. I know that all my friends, developer friends, are actually in that other room, so I thought, you know, if I have 3 people, I'm going to be lucky. So I'm glad you're here. My name is Philip Schroeder. I worked as an interaction designer at the Zurich University of the Arts in a small team, not small but very talented team, since a year, and we're building a web application for the university. It's an open source web app, and it's made for a web archival system for media. So it's kind of like a YouTube, Flickr, SoundCloud combined thing, but for internal use for institutions. So it has sort of really fine-grained permissions and also very flexible metadata. So I'm going to talk about my experiences building this as a designer in an Agile environment. As Michael said before, I also work in Agile in my other company before, so I've been working in Agile for about 4 years. So my topic is sketching, wireframing, and prototyping, and how to do this in team with teamwork. And also how to build the product and using these techniques. So first of all, I've got a question for you all. Twitter. Who has a Twitter account? Please raise your hands. Have a show of hands here. Wow. Okay. Okay. Gosh, some people didn't raise their hands. What's going on? And who is using Twitter every week? Please raise your hands. Okay, that's maybe half the room. And finally, who is actually tweeted here at the front-end conference? Wow, okay, that's quite a few people. So yeah, it's safe to say that Twitter is pretty big. Now, while preparing this talk, I found something on the web, which is the initial sketch of Twitter. So in a way, this is basically how Twitter started. It's from a simple sketch. And look where Twitter is today. So let's pause for a moment and appreciate the beauty and the simplicity of it. It's so basic, and yet it's eye-opening. I mean, figuratively speaking, you know, this is like the first amoeba swimming in the primordial sea. You know, and it's like the initial moment. You know, it's like the Big Bang of this thing, which became its own universe. So the Twitter universe now is huge. They released some statistics. There are now over 1.5 million registered Twitter apps that use the Twitter API. And, well, I would say that's quite a success. And the basic idea that was captured on that sketch clearly caught on, and, well, with a lot of people. There's 600,000 developers using the Twitter API. Clearly, lots of people find this useful to send real-time status messages over the web. So sketching is really a quest to capture value, this value that Twitter now actually has to people. So this is kind of one of the points I want to make, that sketching can be a really powerful starting point for something much bigger. In our industry, there's always new trends, stuff happening. It's kind of a love-hate relationship for me, because I'm excited about the new things, but it also means that you constantly have to adapt and learn new stuff. So I picked out a couple of trends that I think that are kind of relevant to how I work today. First of all, there's this agile development thing, lean startup, content strategy. They all come from their particular environments, so they all have their own literally separate backgrounds. So agile development is mostly done in-house, I think. And lean startup clearly comes from web companies, from the whole web startup scene that is happening, especially in the Silicon Valley. And content strategy is mostly relevant in agencies, where you have sort of traditional communication agencies, where the focus is on the content and marketing. And so we have all these trends, and I think they all influence of how we actually design and develop, and how we actually do the work, our workflows, how we work. So what is this agile thing actually about? Because everybody's talking about it for quite some time now. So again, I would kind of be interested in my audience here. So please raise your hand if you know about Agile. Okay, yeah, that's the majority of people here. Please raise your hands if you had partial experiences with Agile. Oh, wow, okay, that's almost the same amount. And please raise your hands if you work in a 100% Agile environment. Okay, that's 5 or 6 or so. So it's quite a few less. Okay, I'm glad, because if everybody would have raised their hands, basically the first half of my presentation would just be not really useful. But okay, I'll talk a bit about the larger context of my work, because I think when I talk about my everyday work practices, it's important. Context matters, actually. There's not an ideal work or a best practice that works for everyone. I think your work environment very much matters. So let's talk a bit about Agile. This is referenced a lot, and I think it's also important to reference this, the Agile Manifesto. I'll just quickly go through this. So in the Agile Manifesto states that individuals and interactions are more important than processes and tools. Working software is more important than comprehensive documentation. Customer collaboration is more important than contract negotiation. And finally, responding to change is more important than following a plan. So Agile is really contrasted to how most of the people are working still today and have been working before Agile, which is Waterfall, known as the Waterfall process. And to me, the Waterfall process is something like a relay race. So you have a linear, predefined process, and the process is built around skilled specialists and handovers. So like in the relay race, you have the one runner handing over the baton to the next runner. Next runner picks up that baton, runs the next stretch, and so on to the next and to the next. So each member of the team actually runs on his own isolated track. And if one of those members performs badly, the game is lost. Now, in contrast, we've got Agile rugby game. So Agile is more like a rugby game. It's all about teamwork and collaboration. And instead of one big finishing line at the very end of the project, you set and achieve many small goals. The crucial difference really between these two approaches, and it's quite a fundamental difference, the waterfall approach and the agile approach, is something called process control. So how do you actually control how this thing works, how the activities work? So all agile frameworks, and there are a few of them, Scrum is just the most popular and the best known one, but all of them rely on this thing called empirical process control. And the traditional frameworks, and this is true also not just for software development, but even outside of the software world, management in corporations largely relies on this thing called defined process control. So let me talk a little bit about defined process control. So defined process control is basically a chain of activities. And this is usually thought of, there's an input, and then there's an activity, and then there's some output. And the output becomes the input for the next activity. So it's like a chain of input, something happens, transformed, output, and so on. And these activities are actually performed by specialists. So they're really good at this particular activity. And control in this process is actually done by measuring time passed versus time estimated. What does that mean? So if we have a project and we want to build something, we think, okay, so we want to build this, so we need to define this process, we'll have these steps. The individual steps, they might take longer or shorter amount of time, but then we estimate all the individual slots, the individual activities, and then you have the overall big master plan, which says how long it's going to take to build this thing. So in order to find out whether you're right with your plan, you actually look at the individual activities and say, like, okay, how are we doing? Are we going faster? Are we slowing down? Is this activity taking longer than we thought it would be, or are we faster here? So it's like these flexible amounts of time, and you really focus on how long you're taking for these individual activities. Now, defined process control assumes that the flow of actually building whatever you're building is predefined. So you think it up in advance, you make the big master plan, and that's the flow. And this actually, it works really well with flows that are repetitive. You've done them already. You've been there, you know how this thing works. And also with mechanic flows. Because defined process control comes actually out of the industrial age. And this is also why I put this image up on the paper. So basically, this system is something that's been with us since Charlie Chaplin in modern times. It's from the industrial age. Let me quickly tell you a few things about why Waterfall doesn't really work for me. So if you do this big plan and you set the deadlines for all the individual activities, if you trip up, if you do a mistake, well, you end up in a desperate situation. I mean, look at the poor guy's face. And look at the other one. He even lost his shoe, on the way. So it can be pretty bad. You can end up making sacrifices, for just like desperately trying to reach that deadline of the milestone. So here's another thing: know-how silos. Waterfall requires that the managers have all the know-how, and the workers are replaceable. So the big master plan is what matters. The manager knows what the master plan is about, and he has like these individual specialists, and if one of them drops out, it has to be replaced. Agile, conversely, is all about sharing knowledge, and the knowledge is actually happening in the team. Lastly, no tedious spec work. So comprehensive design documentation that is required to enable these handovers from one step to the next step can be really tedious and painful to create. And actually, when you go through all the lengths of doing your specification to enable that handover, at the next person, that specification might not be entirely understandable. And sometimes the specification is simply ignored just because people are overwhelmed by the whole bunch and detail of that specification. So why does Agile actually work for me? So Agile, as I said, is built on this empirical process control. And I can tell you about how this works by the example of Scrum, which is one of the Agile methods. So basically, in Agile, you start with a product backlog, which is basically a list of things that you want to build. You take out a couple of things from that backlog into the sprint planning, and you say, OK, let's start with these couple of things right here. You actually build those things that you said. You have there certain mechanisms to communicate within the developments that you regularly talk to each other every day. Basically, you have a little meeting, 15 minutes, where you talk about how far you got. And then after each iteration, so when you've built those things, you look back and you present what you've built, and you look back on how far have we come. And then you also talk about how did we get here. So empirical process is really saying that in the complex domain where the product is emerging and the practices of how the things need to be built is emerging, you always say you cannot know what is in the future. You can just look at where you are right now, and you can look back, and you can try to understand and analyze how you got here. So this is really the core about this empirical process control. It's empiric because you actually look at the things that exist and that are here. You don't look at the future, but you look at what is here right now and how you got there. So you do these iterations, and in the end, you have the end of the project, and it's either you have to reach the goal that you set out to do, or the money runs out. So what is different really is this loop in the middle. You also have kind of a chain that you start somewhere and you want to end up somewhere, but you just do it by little steps, sort of manageable little iterations. So instead of measuring the time for these individual steps, you just say you set a predefined amount of time. It's all built about this thing which is called time boxing, which just says we'll just work in 2-week iterations or 3-week iterations. At the beginning of the project, you just set that, and that is the fixed amount of time. So instead of having all these flexible amounts of time, you work with a set piece of time, and it gets a rhythm to the project. And at every step after the iteration, you do this exercise here, and you look back. How do you get here? How are we doing? The good thing about this is that the people who are involved, the team is involved in these iterations and its rhythms. They get a good feel of how are they doing as a team. They can feel like, okay, this 2 weeks, we didn't really do that well. The sprint before was much better. We worked much more. We achieved much more in that sprint before. So you get kind of a feel for things and how well you're progressing. So in Scrum, every iteration, we have an increment of working software. And this is actually important because the working software is some value that you can already use. It's a piece of software that people can actually start using. This thing is actually also known as permanent beta in the web world. I mean, we've got Google in the room, so yeah, for me, that's like the epitome of this approach. Also, each iteration, we review the product of what we've built and the process of how we actually work. And the goal is to understand and continuously improve both. Now, in every project, when you start something, there are some uncertainties, and there are 2 basic uncertainties. One is the uncertainty of what is it actually that we want to build? What is the product that we want to build? The other uncertainty is, how are we going to do that? So in Waterfall, they aim to reduce the end uncertainty at the start of the project. So a lot of effort is actually put in reducing that thing called end uncertainty. So what is the thing that we want to build? And this is done through extensive requirements gathering and specification documents. So you really want to nail, like, okay, this is what we want to build. And the assumption is that once you've done that specification, you can just start building the thing, and you only need to figure out how to build it. And this approach is actually often unpractical. I mean, it works, as I said, for many areas. It actually works. I mean, particularly outside of software development, there are lots of things that really work well with this. But in software development, this is often impractical because you divorce the people who need to build the product with the process of understanding what the product is. It's kind of like separated out. In Agile, you try to attack both things at the same time. So you just say, okay, you know, we have a rough idea. I think we've got our vision of what we want to build, but we don't know exactly what it is, but let's just start. So you start in these small baby steps, and you just go along. And while you're doing that, you learn about what it is that you want to build and how to do that. So in Agile, the important thing is really the team. And teamwork really takes the center stage in Agile. And Agile is also a pull system. And what that means is that there's a peer-to-peer exchange of information. So instead of the manager pushing the information out to the individual people, the team pulls the information in. So while they're building, if I need some information, if I don't understand what it is that I have to do or whatever, you just go out and ask for it. So a developer, if some question pops out during development, he will go to the product manager, which is called product owner in Scrum, and ask, like, hey, you know, what do you really mean here? I don't understand this point. Please tell me. So it's also about collective learning. So you learn in the process, and collective responsibility. So you have a shared goal. You want to build the next increment of software. That's your goal. And you know that you have to get there together. And the whole team is responsible for actually achieving that goal. So in Agile, the currency is actually shared understanding. So here we have a typical Agile team. Consists of the product owner, the Scrum Master, developers, designer, tester. And it's really important that they have this shared understanding of what needs to be built and how to build it. Agile is also really inspired strongly by something called lean thinking. Lean thinking originated in Japan and was all about improving the efficiency and the effectiveness. And it's about optimizing the workflow and the information flow to achieve this shared goal. And also, attention is paid to symptoms of stress. So basically, that the system keeps running and doesn't break down, and you want to work at a sustainable pace. Now, Agile is adopted widely in the software development world. And UX design, on the other hand, is somewhat rooted in the waterfall process, and UX is still sort of working more in the waterfall way of working. So people are now experimenting of how to actually combine these two. And I think there are a few principles emerging. It's just we don't really know, and we haven't really gotten there of how to integrate this. But there are some patterns emerging, and some of them are here, like communicate fast and light by sketching, and work in small and continuous cycles, and collaborative actively across roles. So this is also something in the design world which is called participatory design. So how this actually works in practice is that there are parallel tracks, and the UX is ahead of development. So the product owner and the developer, the designer typically work together and sprint ahead of the development. Now what this means, though, is that the role of design and the role of the designer is changing. If you start to work like this, it's actually a real change. And before, designers were really used to being superheroes. Something like a magician. You know, they would work alone behind the stage, preparing their magic, the design. And then, you know, rarely the designer steps onto the stage, you know, at a few rare occasions. And then he presents his design, you know, like pulling rabbits magically out of his hat. So this is like the big reveal, you know, like, wow, here are my designs, you know, bam. And Agile, on the other hand, embraces collaborative design and small iterations, not these sort of big moments of like big revelations. In Agile, the designer's role is really quite different. It's more of a keeper of the vision, and foremost, you're a facilitator. So here you see the designer's in the middle, and the designer is really someone who sits in the center of a lot of communication between the people who are actually building the software and the people who the software is for, so the users. So UX is all about user-centered. So the designer takes on this role of like getting the information from the users, talking to them frequently, to the maybe UX researcher, and sort of being more of a helper and facilitator to get to this shared understanding. A way of doing that is prototyping. In prototyping, or in this work practice here, you actually visualize and share concepts all the time. So, work in progress. My stuff is always up on the walls for everybody to see. There are many tools and approaches for prototyping. And here, they're ordered by fidelity. So on the left axis, you have the visual fidelity, so how close is the thing, does the thing actually look to the real thing, to the end product you want to achieve? And then on the other axis, we've got the functional fidelity, so how close does this actually work, the interactions, how do they work to the real thing? And its the most basic tool on the very lower left is a sketch, a pen and paper sketch. And then if you go up in the higher, up in the horizontal, you go at the very top, at the top left, you have like Photoshop mockups. So they have a very high visual fidelity. And at the very top right, this is like almost where it's not a prototype anymore. That's actually the real thing. That is the working code, the working product. So it behaves and looks very closely or exactly like the real thing. So there are all these tools for prototyping. So how do I pick the right one? And here's a list of criteria, really, for picking the right tool for the right occasion. And I think the two that matter most are the first ones here, which is audience and intent. So who am I building this prototype for, and what do I want to achieve with this prototype? And I mean, this may sound very basic, but I think it's really the most important things to consider here. There are other criteria, and a really important one is also the speed and the cost. How much does it cost to build the prototype? How fast can I do it? So on the axis, you can see sketching is incredibly cheap and fast, and the higher up you go, the longer it takes and the more expensive it becomes. So building the actual real product takes a long time, relatively to just scribbling on a bit of paper, obviously. There are also different uses of prototypes. I'll go through them in more detail. You can also map these different uses of prototypes onto the different tools. So certain tools are better at serving these uses than others. So let me talk about sketching. At the beginning of a project, or in Agile, at the beginning of each iteration, sketching with pen and paper is incredibly useful. And this is not a new revelation. I mean, designers have done this for ages. And I mean, mankind has done this for ages, like putting some marks onto some surface. What is really quite important about this is sketchiness. What is sketchiness? Sketchiness means that it's unfinished, it's a bit rough, it has holes. But this is a good thing, because it invites critique, it invites feedback. This is unfinished, yeah, talk to me, okay, improve me. And with the unfilled holes, they can actually be useful because they can create new ideas. You try to make sense of what you're seeing, and you go like, I don't really understand this, and like, you know, maybe this is there's a complete other thing. Oh, that's interesting. Maybe we should go in that direction instead. And the opposite of this is high fidelity. So a fully fleshed out Photoshop comp is just it says I'm finished, I'm done, I'm perfect, I'm full of fleshed out ideas. You know, and actually, while it does that on a visual level, it says that, it communicates that immediately, it might not be true. You know, that Photoshop mock-up might not be so well thought out. It's just that's what it looks like on first glance. So a polished Photoshop mock-up is too much work, actually, to start at the beginning of a project, or when you're still trying to figure out what you're actually building, or what is the actual solution, or what is the problem even. So sketching is incredibly useful, and there are also different uses for sketching. I'll talk about them step by step and in more detail. So sketching is incredibly useful as a research tool for me. So if you look at existing solutions for inspiration, or also if you look at a competitor product, I often make sketches of those things that I see. So I draw a little sketch and I make some notes on the side of it with annotations. And this actually helps me to internalize and to understand what I'm seeing. And this is really interesting in this sketching process, is that it's almost like communication between you and the sketch. The sketch talks back to you. And in the process, you kind of internalize that conversation and those thoughts that you have. So sketching is also useful for thinking through a concept. It's really great to figure out content, and also like the information architecture. You know, what is the stuff that needs to be on there? You know, and where does it fit? And also the interaction, like, okay, what is first, and then what is afterwards, and where do we go next? And in this case, I was exploring a graph data structure and ways how to visualize that structure. Now, wireframe sketches, they're really good of working through a design in more detail. For experimenting with layout, sketches don't really need to be pretty. It's the easiest way to visualize an idea, and it's in a fast and cheap way. Then sketching as shared communication. It helps me to lay out a design challenge even. So just figuring out like, okay, what is the problem here? What is the problem we need to solve? And just write stuff on sticky notes and put it up on a flip chart and just sort of take it apart, your challenge that you have to solve in your design. So it's good for exploring that challenge personally, but it's also good as a basis of discussion with the other team members. So you've got this wall, you've got all these sticky notes, and you can gather around and you can start pointing at notes and discussing things. And sketching also helps you to clarify concepts in your discussions. So you can actually draw something, and then you can point to that, and you can say, like, is this what you meant? is this what you mean? And then he can go like, oh, no, look, I mean this. And then he'll sketch. So it's a way of clarifying communication. Sketching is also useful for validating design direction. So if you have features that have complex controls and multiple states, a paper prototype really enables you to simulate that interaction. So you can get like someone to test your prototype with. You get a colleague, a team member, or someone from outside the team, and you say, look, here, I've got this, look at it, say you want to do this and that, and then he starts saying like, okay, I would click on this, and then you put in, you swap over the little pieces of paper, and this way you actually interactively explore the idea and the concept. Clean wireframes, or digital wireframes. I use them mostly for like screen design and for details, if it has to be. So if I need to investigate the space proportions of how things are laid out, how many items are they, how big are they, how does it fit together. Diagrams like sitemaps or flowcharts are also commonly used design documentation. I only make those on request. So if there's stakeholders that need to have a discussion about the overview of all the content that is on the site or how the workflows work in the applications. But the problem with these kinds of documentations is that since the other team members, so the non-designers, they rarely bother to learn this diagramming tool to produce this thing. So what happens is you're the only one in charge to update that thing, and that never happens. So it's really risk of really becoming outdated documentation very quick. There's also the interactive digital wireframe. These are useful if you have like complex layouts or pages where there's different alternative views to the same content, and there are certain elements are shared. You have also hybrids. So feel free to creatively combine these methods. So here I just did a screenshot of the existing app, and I just overlaid some sketches onto the thing to visualize how this new overlay thingy might work. So the high-fidelity prototypes, as I said earlier, is basically at the very top layer, where the thing that you design actually looks like the real thing. There's also something that comes from the Agile world. In Agile, there's a thing called pair programming, where two programmers sit in front of a computer and write some code together. And this also works cross-functionally for pairing up an interaction designer and a front-end developer, for example. So here's an example where we just went from sketch, so I drew this little sketch, right to the working code on the testing server, so the next increment of the software, by just doing it right there in front of the computer together. This is actually cool because you just sort of do the absolute minimum of like getting an idea of, okay, what is the thing that we are building now and how long will it take us? So you can make an estimation in the Agile planning. You can estimate, okay, let's invest this and that much time building this. And there's no time wasted in actually writing out all the details, but that can happen in discussion while you're building it. So now I've really talked a lot about these low-fi fidelity prototypes. When is it actually useful to produce a high-fidelity prototype? And I think there are some good reasons to do that. It just might not be the best thing to do at the very beginning of the project. So if your audience is the client or users or maybe an external development team, basically not people within your close circle and your team, then it's useful. So if you're selling an idea, or if you want to do usability testing, or if you have to have detailed design specifications. So what is the takeaway of all of this? And I tried to think about it from the different perspectives. And I think for developers, building software is a creative process. And designers actually have great tools for creativity. So I just say, adapt and learn, like make the best of both worlds. And from a product manager perspective, I think product management just needs to recognize and accept the creative process of software development. And yes, it's messy, and there's almost like a looping circularity, of like going back and forward of some idea, you go back and forward. But that's actually how we learn and how we improve. That's just how it works. And and take work in progress as what it is. Takeaway for designers, I think if you're coming or if you're working in a waterfall environment, one of the biggest takeaways really is that keep focused on the value, because you can get lost in the deliverables, and the design itself, the design documentation. But that's not really the valuable to anyone outside of the project. Keep focused on the real user value, the thing, the software, the thing that you're building, the user experience of that software. And remove everything that is not valuable, as much as you can. And be pragmatic. Use whatever fits the situation. So don't think, this looks crap. I'm a visual designer. This needs to look pretty. So be pragmatic. It's about the end goal and getting there. And visualize and share your work. Invite critique. And I mean, this, I say these, but it took me myself quite a bit to get there. It's because you're used to a different world, really. So, I think I've fallen down on many of these aspects myself. Also, get feedback often, because it helps you, to catch mistakes early on. In the sketch, it's much better to catch a mistake when you've just done a little scribble and a little sketch, instead of having produced like a really elaborate and beautiful Photoshop comp. And then it turns out that this is the whole, this is the wrong thing. There's some mistakes in there. It's really just frustrating as well. If you spend a lot of time and effort of building the thing and then discover it's all wrong, it's wasted time. And every feedback session and every encounter with whoever on the team, with the product manager, developers, whoever, it's really an opportunity to learn from the other. And it's also an opportunity to practice on arguing for your design, and talking and verbalizing of why you came up to this solution. This is actually, I think, a skill that is actually very important for designers and design. So I also see some drawbacks and limitations. I mean, I've talked about lots of benefits and cool things about Agile and combining these two approaches. But I mean, in reality, in our project right now, is that if you haven't spent some time up front doing something more waterfallish, or like seeing the big picture and creating this vision, there's a real risk that you end up with something completely messy. It's like an architect. You want to build a house, and then you start, on that little corner, you build up a little wall over there, and then you move over here, and then you start painting that wall, and you go to the other opposite corner of the house. So in the end, when the house is there, there's a high chance that this thing might not look very consistent. So you actually need to spend, at the end of the project, you need to spend time going over all the bits and cleaning them up and making them consistent. And that's really reality for me right now. That's it, really. I'm at the end of my presentation. I really don't want to miss the opportunity for big thanks to my teams I've worked with. I've been honored to work with these guys. It's the Rails team at Zurich University of the Arts, and also the Team P at Leap, my previous employer. And also I would like to thank my wife for being really a patient beta tester for this presentation. So yeah, please, if you have questions, ask them now. We still have some time, and if some questions might come to your mind later on, please feel free to contact me and get in touch. Yeah, thank you. Question. Okay. Okay. Okay, let me quickly try to rephrase the question to see if I understood, and maybe also for the external listeners. So the question, I think, is that how, if I could elaborate a bit about this thing called the product vision, and that the designer, that his role is actually of being the keeper of this vision, and how the collaboration works between the product owner, who also has a bit of that role of being the keeper of the vision, and the designer. And, you know, I wish I had a better answer for you, but this is actually a big question mark for myself. And we're actually asking this question. I run a little meetup on meetup.com. You can go and look it up. It's called Agile UX Switzerland. And these are the topics we're talking about right there. I mean, actually, it's next week we have a session about how does this collaboration between the product owner and the designer work. And we had already sessions about what needs to be in place before you start an Agile product. Or, you know, what is the thing up front, this vision work that has to happen up front before it makes sense to start this Agile development process. Okay, and so he has some follow-on questions, which are like, how do you actually integrate this Agile process into a business context, and how does it all work with like, you know, money and contracts and all that? And there again, I can say, I mean, I have maybe some clues to these big topics, but again, I think there are people that are more experienced than myself who can actually talk about that. So, I mean, the Agile world, you know, in the software has had to answer these questions for quite some time now. So it's like 10 or 15 years. And I mean, at Leap, in particular, my previous employer, you know, they also had to answer those kinds of questions, and it's an ongoing process. And they found some answers, but not all of them. Okay, any more questions? Yes, in the back. Mm. Okay, so the question, if I understand correctly, is if I have any tips of how to actually establish this design framework. And as I said to your previous speaker, is that I don't really have the definitive answer on that. But I've been also teaching, and in my teaching, I've also been experimenting with exactly that question: how to arrive at sort of a vision or a product roadmap. And in my experiments with my students, I just used what kind of the school book, you know, for this kind of thing, which is actually a book that I really highly recommend by Kim Goodwin. She's been working at Cooper Design, which is really famous and big design firm in the States, and she wrote this really thick book. You know, I don't remember the exact title, but I can tell you later on. And I didn't really read that book for a long time because it was just so thick. You know, it's just this big tome. But actually, if you read it, it's really worth it because she really explains why it makes sense, why each steps and the approaches actually make sense, and why it works for them. not just like, this is how you do it, and not reflecting on it. So, I mean, this is perhaps the single best book I read sort of on that subject. I highly recommend it. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't have an answer to that one either. So the question is about this design framework that needs to happen up front. And the question is like, how long or how much time do you invest in that upfront project in comparison to the building stage, the agile development stage? And I don't have a different number. I wish I could tell you, it's a ratio of 33.5% to, I don't have that answer. And it probably matters also very much on what the project is, what context you're doing your thing. But again, I mean, I want to know as well. And this is also why I'm running this meetup where we just talk and discuss like how we work in practice and how this works for us and what works and what doesn't work to figure out these questions. So my current project at the Zurich University of the Arts, I'm coming in at the tail end of the project, so it's like the whole duration of the thing is 3 years, and I'm working in the last year. So I don't know exactly how it went before, like what that stage exactly looked like and how long it took, so I don't know. But in other projects before, I think it was about 3 months. The sort of the pre-project ran over the duration of 3 months, and then the actual building of the kind of the product in its first big bang release, because we did several iterations, but we didn't release every single iteration, but like after, I think it was 7, we released the thing and announced it to the world kind of thing. But it's still ongoing, so they are still adding on to that product iteratively now. So it was 7 iterations of 3 weeks in my team. And the pre-project ran over a duration of 3 months, but that's not like 3 months of solid work, because in the pre-project, it's important to get all the stakeholders involved, and they don't have time and so on. So it's like really thinly spread out over those 3 months. It's like, I don't know, a couple of meetings every 3 or 4 meetings where you have workshops with stakeholders, that kind of thing. Another question? Okay, so the question I'm hearing is, can I elaborate a bit more about how it works in practice with Agile UX, how the roles work and in the team? Because you have a team with people with different roles, but it's also, the goal is that everybody does everything, kind of thing, or that's the question, like, is that the goal or not? And yes and no. I think, again, it depends on the people and the situation right there. I mean, there are so many constraints. So if you have a sort of a greenfield project, where you're setting up something entirely fresh, the answer to your question will be different than if you were working in an existing structure. So I don't know. I think, there's no black and white answer again. I'm sorry, this is sort of the typical answer of a designer, is like, it depends. But I don't know. But I think if you really take those principles that I talked about to heart, you just have to figure out a way to work the system, to make it work for you as a team. And I think this probably has a higher chance of success in in-house products, in in-house product design, because basically the way I work is we're all in one room, right? It's easy to communicate. Everybody's co-located. It becomes, that sort of thing becomes, I think, really difficult when it's like you have to work remotely. So, yeah, it really depends. So in-house, I think you have a higher chance of actually making that work, like the collaboration and the roles and like where are the boundaries and all that. And in agencies where you're always working as an outsider, I think that's much more difficult. And I mean, other people before me who are experimenting with this Agile UX have already said that the agency model of how they're working and their business model is really coming into question with this approach. Because the business model of agencies is the deliverables. So there's a whole presentation on this topic actually called Getting Out of the Deliverables Business. Also, I recommend sort of Googling for that. Because the deliverables are the design spec which is used for these handovers, right? Like the agency builds the spec, and then that is sort of thrown over the wall to development. They use the spec, and then they do their thing. That's very much sort of ingrained into that business model. They sell the deliverables to the customers, and the time spent doing those deliverables. And Agile, it doesn't work like that. And finally, I mean, in this greenfield scenario, which is like startups, right? Startup companies. I think there we have probably the biggest chance, of succeeding and sort of making the right decisions at the very beginning. And I think this is also probably why this lean startup movement is really, getting track, and it's really being used and talked about a lot, because it's just like a real good fit with starting a business. Because if you think about these concepts beforehand, you can make the right decisions right early on. And I mean, again, my previous employer, in a way, was like a startup. I mean, I've not worked at a company that grew so fast. Like after 1 year of working there were like more people employed after me than there were there before. So I was considered like an old guy at the company, like after 1 year. And this was like a really new experience to me. And again, I mean, God bless them. I mean, they just sort of made some really good decisions, I guess, early for the company. And one of them was that, this Agile thing, we're really going to build that into our company. So at Leap, it's actually the administrative team is doing Scrum. They're doing iterations for the administrative work, So that's something. I had this thought, but I think I've lost it now. There was another part of your question I wanted to answer. I don't know. Maybe I'll have it later. Any more questions?
Okay, I have one.
Okay.
As you talked about the meetup, are you interested in having more people there? And if yes, how can people find about it?
Well, the answer is no.
Good. That's fine.
Sorry, I mean, obviously you can find it if you Google for it. But no, I mean, maybe I need to explain. I feel I need to explain.
You don't have. I mean,
it's well, I don't know. I haven't really figured out because I mean, we've only run 2 sessions, but I really like those 2 sessions, and they were just like a really small group of people, and that really worked really well, I found. But obviously, I think we need to find ways of like growing or doing it. And I was very strict about it. No, it's just basically I don't know exactly how we're going to do this in the future.
Okay, that's perfect.
Thanks for asking. So, any more questions? Okay, thank you very much, and please be free to get in touch.